Hi, and welcome to Drafting Compliance. I'm Kayne, he's Tom, and we talked with Victoria Southwell last time. Today, we're talking with our special guest, Alexander Neff, lecturer at ASU and Senior Director of InfoSec at Faro Health. But before we get to that, we have some beers. What are we drinking today, Alex?
Well, today we are drinking Lindemans Framboise. It is a Belgian.
Yours is smaller. What happened there?
You bought the big bottle. Congratulations, you win.
Oh, dear me. Okay, tell us about Lindemans Framboise?
Framboise.
Framboise.
Ooh, okay, very French. Tell us about it, Alex.
Belgian. Not French. You know, they have French in Belgium too,
Oh, okay.
I believe.
Our Belgian viewers are going to be sending us all kinds of complaints in the comments. That's fantastic.
There's a whole thing there. When you visit Belgium, you understand they're Dutch and Belgian, they go at it. But that being said, this is the beer. It's very fruity. It's a lambic. It's different than most lambics. Lambics have a very interesting flavor. This is a very, very weak beer, 2% or so. It actually takes some work to open up.
So it's basically a breakfast beer is what I'm hearing. And given it's 9 a.m. here on the West Coast.
I think it's an aperitif.
It has a cute little man in a top hat with a, I'm not sure if that's coming through, but I think that's a fantastic logo. Is this a screw top or is it a?
Nope, it's a pop top.
Okay, cool. I got a bottle opener here.
Yeah, if anybody doesn't know, lambic beers are really interesting because they're meant to be fermented with naturally occurring yeast.
What?
So back in the day, a lambic was just brewed in the open and
it has a cork.
Oh, ours doesn't. I'm pouring mine.
I got hard mode here, guys. Go get a bottle opener here. This is going to be weird. Just wander away. Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, no problem, Kayne. We bought the human-sized bottle, so we're fine.
I was afraid that I wasn't going to be able to get the small one because I wasn't ready to commit myself to a full 750 milliliters in the morning.
Well, you could always put the cork back in. This is so interesting. I've had this, but it's been years since I've had it.
I really like it on draft. I mean, it's good in the bottle too, but it's definitely not something you're going to want to drink a lot of, but you'll enjoy the time you drink it.
Yeah, I've told folks to try this in the past as their initiation into beer. If they really have an aversion to beer, this is an easy one to sort of.
Tom, how have we never had this conversation then, my friend? If you
I
tell
don't know.
people to try this.
I mean, part of this show is to watch you suffer. So we enjoy that part of the show. Let's see how good Kayne is with the corkscrew.
Easy. It's a standard tool in my bar. Weirdly, it popped as well.
Are you a wine drinker?
Almost exclusively, except for on the show. So here goes.
So you should see a very red pour.
Not the color I'm expecting here, guys. I'm going to recork this, I think. Because I just heard we can recork it.
Your pour is about equal to the small bottle, so good job. It is
so
a
this
small
looks
bottle.
Like a.
So.
Oh, this looks like a Lambrusco. Are we drinking Lambrusco, guys? Is that what we're doing?
Well, it's a lambic, but I don't know what Lambrusco is.
Yeah, no idea.
Lambrusco is an Italian wine. It's a red sparkling wine. It's good in the summer.
Well, you'll notice by the color, Kayne, it's extremely red, so it's raspberry.
This smells so much like raspberries. Now I'm reminded of the raspberry sour that my friend Cody, hi Cody, put me through.
What's interesting about this beer, if I remember right, is generally lambics are sour, but this lambic I think is sweet, if I remember.
It's both sweet and sour. Right, well, lambics can be funky.
Sweet and sour and funky.
Let's give it a taste.
Let's have a go and see what this is like.
Tart, sweet and tart. You get sort of the tartness of the raspberry. You don't necessarily get a bunch of the raspberry flavor. At least I don't.
Well, I'll give you one thing. This does not taste like beer.
Well, at 2.5%, there's not a lot of alcohol to, in your case, spoil it, I guess.
Well, it's not just that. It tastes more like like I say, it's like a Lambrusco. But it's like a raspberry Lambrusco, which is not a thing that exists in the world. Um, and it has a very strong raspberry flavor. Like that's the only flavor profile I'm getting off this thing. You getting anything else
Yeah,
off this, Tom or Alex?
It's very one-dimensional.
it's very tart.
Yeah.
So the flavors I would say is tart, sweet. In when you eat a raspberry, you get that sweet berry flavor at first and the tartness on the back. I just get the
Mm-hmm.
tartness on the back. But this is not hard to drink. I mean, my goodness, it's not far from Kool-Aid.
You're not wrong. You're not wrong. I can see how this. This feels like a college party drink, maybe. Although you probably have to add
No,
vodka to it in
not at
order to
what this
actually make it
costs.
kick.
This is not.
Oh,
This is definitely not a college party. You forget college.
well, I
Kool-Aid
only
and
went
the
for the
cheapest
one
liquor you can
semester,
get.
so it
Yeah.
did not work out.
I couldn't imagine getting drunk off of this because the amount of it you'd have to drink and the amount of tartness you'd have to go through to get there would, I mean,
Yeah.
it's tasty, but trying to imagine drink like a half gallon of this because that's probably what you would need in order to feel the alcohol in it.
No. Okay, that is a straight up bad idea. Um, well, we're going to poke at this one throughout. Tom sees that I usually will have a sniff of this halfway through and see if the flavor profile changes, and I'll be curious to see if the raspberry flavor calms down at all by the end of the show or not. But before the show, Alex, we were talking about your experience that was at a small company, and you were telling me you had SOC 2 Type 2 and you were working towards FedRAMP. So, can you, for our viewers, just describe your initial challenges the company faced when you were starting your journey to achieve FedRAMP moderate, given that you'd been in business for 2 decades and had a lot of existing technical debt?
Being a small company and not having a lot of resources, honestly, we didn't want to go to FedRAMP. We did everything we could possibly do to avoid it. And part of it was just trying to understand what it was to go to FedRAMP. Just getting over that hump of understanding, the JAB, ATO, agency, understanding exactly what, classification we had to be. All of that was a pretty big lift in itself just to understand what's it going to take to get there. And the more we dug into it, the more difficult and the more expensive it seemed. And you have to have FedRAMP ready if you want to be able to get to the next level. You get a FedRAMP ready, it only lasts 90 days or whatever it is. And, it's expensive to do it and time consuming. And if you don't get your ATO in time, you have to do it again. And trying to communicate how costly it was going to be and the value that came back from that to upper management was not easy. And trying to bridge that gap of when it would make sense to, I'd say, punch to try to make that next step was a difficult choice to make.
How much education did you have to do? Because to me, that's always a big challenge, especially in the smaller organizations that aren't necessarily compliance centric to begin with. There's a lot of education just into the executive team, in my experience.
I mean, it took the better part of a year, I think, for us to actually work our way through what our approach could be. And it was still wavering. And honestly, it would change depending on the contract that was coming through. With a lot of our customers, they didn't necessarily require FedRAMP. They were telling us we had to have it, but at the same time, they were giving us signals that we didn't.
Interesting. That sounds familiar, Tom, doesn't it? Like, we don't need you to have FedRAMP, but you have to have FedRAMP. It's that mixed messaging that Alex, have you ever felt like somebody in purchasing department, like one of those outsourced contract management companies, saw that everybody had a SOC 2 Type 2 and said, well, that seems too easy now. So what's our next differentiation? And somehow they figured, well, FedRAMP moderate sounds good. Have you ever thought that? Like just somebody pulled it out of thin air?
I mean, that's what it sure feels like because a few of the states started saying, well, we only go with FedRAMP. I don't know if they actually looked at the marketplace, but there's not a whole lot of companies on there. So if you're going all FedRAMP for SaaS, you are limiting yourself to a very small subset of choices.
That's
definitely
true.
Very true.
I mean, and what we see is in any given sort of vertical or market within IT, right? There's 1, 2, maybe 3 companies that have the ATO through FedRAMP. So not only are you limited, but your pricing goes way up because there's just no competition in there.
But
yeah, well, I know also that FIPS is a big part of FedRAMP. And I'm curious, Alex, how the requirement to comply with FIPS standards, particularly in a Windows infrastructure, were really a challenge for you to achieve that FedRAMP moderate status.
Well, FedRAMP would have been a lot easier if FIPS didn't exist. I could tell you that
A
much.
lot of things would be easier if FIPS didn't exist.
And I won't lie, it felt very, very arbitrary because I understand, getting FIPS validation, you have to make sure the encryption is up to snuff, but FIPS having to have validated encryption with every software that you use across the chain of what you're offering is extremely difficult because it's expensive to get the validation. And as a result, a lot of the software companies simply don't have it built into their software. And having a Windows environment, which I'll admit is pretty unusual for most modern SaaS applications, made it that much more difficult because Windows FIPS mode is notoriously bad. Um, Microsoft themselves say don't use it for a reason. And for us, we actually had to start going back to the drawing board. We were already kind of transitioning to modern microservices in the cloud. And that kind of facilitated going faster into that transition because we effectively had no choice. We were not going to make it work on Windows.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is most people even in information security who don't have to deal with something like a FedRAMP or CMMC, they're not familiar with FIPS at all. So just that learning curve to get up to speed is pretty significant. And then when you learn that your trusted, infrastructure provider or technology provider hasn't implemented a robust FIPS solution at all, where they've done it somewhat, I would say halfway. That's a trouble spot. And you can look at the forums online. Everybody's complaining about it, yet it still exists in this sort of quasi environment. It's a difficult challenge.
Yeah, and I like that Alex brought up that it was, even Microsoft says you probably shouldn't do this. And I think that beyond FedRAMP, as you mentioned, Tom, CMMC World is also seeing that challenge as well with having FIPS validated solutions, and having that across the entire environment is very difficult. Alex, I'm curious, did you move to microservices as part of the transition, or were you able to actually get FIPS to run correctly on Windows?
We tried. We tried. I'll leave it at that. We could not get it to work the way we expected. A big part of it was a lot of the software that we used at the time simply just had no care for FIPS at all. They never had that need. They didn't build it into their products. And we were already making that transition. And so for us, we tried for a while and we're like, yeah, this isn't happening. Everything broke. We kept going through cycles trying to fix it again. And the only way to fix it was to disable FIPS.
Nice. Oh, that mirrors some of my own experiences with FIPS too. Okay. Well, you also had SOC 2 at the same time, right? So let's talk about that. Like, you had ongoing SOC 2 Type 2 compliance efforts. How did those align, or alternatively, how did they vary from the demands of ongoing FedRAMP moderate compliance?
I'm kind of curious where the security compliance world would be today if FIPS was required for SOC 2.
Yeah, that's a great point, because SOC 2 is something that's been around for decades that everybody has sort of gotten comfortable with, right? So if that had been required earlier, we would be in a much better position.
SOC 2 has,
but outside of the FIPS thing, were you able to find a lot of alignment with SOC 2 and FedRAMP?
I think SOC 2 has its value. I mean, every compliance standard, there's only so many security controls out there. Like if you look at 853, with controls and subcontrols, it's 1,000. It may sound like a lot, but that's effectively exhaustive. Like you kind of have almost everything there. And SOC 2 maybe hits 10% of it. Maybe it hits 50% of it, but at a high level. It helped kind of set the stage, but I wouldn't say that it really prepared us for what that next level was. It was a very small stepping stone in what was required to make it to that FedRAMP level.
Yeah, I think there's probably two things that are really valuable about SOC 2. First, it starts to educate your company early into what a control is and what some costs might be associated with it, and it sets a benchmark. So you can look at SOC 2 and educate the people that are asking you to get to FedRAMP and say, well, SOC 2 is 10%. That means 10% of the controls. It also means 10% of the cost. So if you really want to go towards FedRAMP, you have to be willing to go that extra, 90% to get there. So it's a useful education tool, and certainly it's a useful marketing tool. So we provide our SOC 2. I'm sure you provide your SOC 2 all the time.
But the other thing, ultimately, Tom, that means is that you can reuse, you can automatically collect and reuse probably 10% of the evidence that you're already collecting for your SOC 2 Type 2, you can reapply towards FedRAMP. So at least if you've moved into compliance operations and you're automating that, you don't have to redo that work. It's not like, because one of the things I've frequently heard from people who are audited is they have to send the same piece of evidence to 2 different auditors or 30 different auditors in some cases. At least there is some reuse there, right? Alex, did you find that you were able to reuse some of your evidence?
Very much so. I mean, we had a very wide range of customers across a whole bunch of different compliance requirements, and every single one that we added was the same set of controls, just a different set added on top of that. So you kind of just kept growing and growing and ideally repeating. Though we did struggle to find third-party authorizing officials or whatnot to help actually take all of the controls at once and apply them in different frameworks. They wanted to have each one be an individual audit, which it's fun giving the same controls, the same evidence is nice, but to actually have to give that same evidence 4 times to the same third party to attest it is kind of a little bit of a drag. But
what you're missing there is the profit margin, my friend, because if they can audit you 4 times on 4 different things, that's 4 different bills, right?
yeah.
But I want to go back to what you were saying there about customers, because I think when we were initially talking about this, the company we're at hoped to serve a whole broad range of customer industries, and you were going to try to open up new markets. So how did that flexibility influence your approach to meeting things like, I don't know, CGIS or ISO 27001 or FedRAMP or maybe even state ramp? Like, were you able to achieve all those or to reuse some of your evidence for that?
Definitely able to reuse. One thing as a security guy in a software company that has a level of regulation required, it's a lot easier to sell to upper management because there's actual ROI on hitting these different targets. So if we have to get CGIS, if we have to get ISO 27001, each one of these opens a new part of the market. And if we can kind of ladder them to where we add another 5 or 10 controls, then we hit the next one. Now we're ISO or we're 800.170 or we're FISMA or something of that nature. After that, maybe we try to make it to low on 853. And then after that, we can try to make it to medium in 853. Then we can try to transition that into FedRAMP. If we kind of ladder it and keep opening up the market, then we can get direct ROI on everything that we hit. And we don't have to do it all at once. We can kind of make our way slowly up to those further goals.
Yeah, stretching the dollar, so to speak. I think that's smart. And certainly if you look at some of these packages, they're almost repackages, right? For instance, state ramp, you can fast track state ramp now. So you can submit your FedRAMP and then submit your state ramp at the same time with essentially the same package. You have to change the submittal name on the top. But so the reality is there's a lot of overlap on a lot of these. So your laddering can effectively be a fast track if you want to look at it that way.
But I also like that Alex is tying it to top line revenue. So we're not doing cybersecurity because hackers from Russia. We're doing it because of business reasons, right? There's actually legitimate revenue that can be attained as a result of achieving these additional compliance attestations. But alternatively, you also can say, well, we have revenue at risk, right? You can either get locked out of markets, or alternatively, if you don't maintain those controls and pay the certification and attestation fees, those 4 ones we were talking about there, right? That actually becomes one of those things like, when my kids were short, right? There were those things that roller coasters would say, you have to be this tall in order to ride this. And I think that's where SOC 2 right now is that it's equivalent to that roller coaster. Like, if you don't have a SOC 2 Type 2, you are going to start getting locked out of the marketplace. And I could see that in the future, as we become, unfortunately, more regulated as an industry or across industries, we're going to see more of that action where compliance becomes a requirement, not just a good idea. And would you say that's true, Alex, in your conversations with senior management, that tying it to revenue really does help them understand the business point of doing this, and it's not just cybers because controls are neat?
I would very much say so, because it's extremely hard to sell FUD. Fear, uncertainty, and doubt. If you look at Change Healthcare, they just how many health records did they just lose? I mean, it was maybe half of the country's health records, unknown amount, a vast amount, and the stock price just kept carrying on forward. Nothing changed.
Yeah.
It wasn't long
That was the
ago.
third one of the year, by the way.
I've lost count personally. And
Yeah.
FUD, to me, it seems like it's going to have less and less returns over time unless there's something to be scared of. Because if a breach doesn't impact your bottom line, whatever, it happens. It doesn't, 5 or 6 years ago, maybe it was 10, I don't know, I lose track. Home Depot got hacked. I don't know if you guys remember the Home Depot hack. When it happened,
I remember that one, yeah.
It was a huge deal. And honestly, looking back, it's a drop in the bucket comparison to what we have now. But when it happened 10 years ago, everybody was freaking out about it. And now,
same with Target. Yep.
Yeah, same with Target.
It's breach fatigue ultimately, where people are just, you get another letter in the mail that says your data have been breached, and you're like, okay, it's Tuesday. Huh, that's neat. What do I do with this? Right? Consumers are just no longer triggered by that.
Oh, do I get a free health check on my credit?
We all get those. I think I've got in perpetuity at this point.
Stacking them. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll
it's
just
ridiculous.
Continue getting those.
So if I'm trying to sell to upper management, I can't sell them on that anymore because there's no returns. But that's why it's nice to be in my position, a software company, because offering a new compliance standard opens the market. There's a direct return on what's being offered from security. So security isn't just a cost center, it's an asset. And that's a much easier place to be in.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And if you're enjoying this conversation on YouTube, ring the bell to get notifications about my quest to find literally any beer that's drinkable, or subscribe to this podcast in your podcast app of choice to make this part of your routine. So, Alex, you'd mentioned that FedRAMP for you was a multi-year project at your company. Can you walk us through the high-level timeline and some key milestones of the process?
I think a lot of it was we'll get there as fast as we can. Like any software company, it's about customers, right? It's about revenue. And we had some customers come across and say, well, we need you to make FedRAMP. And these things go into contract, and you try to meet the contract to the best of your ability. And everything's about risk. So if you don't hit the points in the contract, it doesn't necessarily mean the contract will be up. Both the customer and you have to decide whether that risk profile is something that's worth accepting. And if you're close enough, sometimes that's enough. So if we hit all the controls of FedRAMP, but we aren't on the marketplace, will a customer accept us? Well, it depends on their risk profile. And for us, it's kind of laddering our way up to different compliance standards, opening the market, while at the same time trying to hit as much of FedRAMP as possible. It was actually towards the end of this process where we had a couple of customers getting far enough into their implementation process where we had to start to take it to the next level of actually getting a system security plan out there. To me, I felt like that was my thesis, my doctorate thesis. Like I was so happy. I had a system security plan. It's like 300 pages. I'm like, guys, check this thing out. It took me like 3 years to build this thing. And it's already all outdated because it took me 3 years to build it. But, once you got the system security plan, I think customers started to see, oh, wow, these guys actually are, taking this seriously. And maybe we had a good 5% of controls, like FIPS. Some things took a little bit longer, and we kind of had those on the back burner. We were working through them while making larger changes that were more difficult and expensive to make. But we were showing enough progress across the board with those kinds of things to keep customers along for the journey because they felt comfortable with the progress that we were making towards the overall goal before going to production.
What was the total timeline for you?
I would say it was about 2 to 2.5 years.
Okay. Yeah. So you're still, I think, under average.
Familiar.
Yeah. I think average is right at 3.
Yeah. And
on background, Alex, part of the reason we started this show is we were on a 1-year FedRAMP journey. Right, Tom? 1 year?
That's right.
Can't remember which one of those years it was, but it was one of those years.
Yeah.
So 2.5 years.
It takes more time than anybody thinks. It's like any do-it-yourself project. It's 3 times the amount of money, 3 times the amount of time.
Yeah, and I want to talk about this because just going back to compliance, because you've got a lot of standards that you're working with right now, Alex, and like it often compliance is thought of as being like you have to focus on meeting these standards. But in our conversation before, you mentioned a focus on meeting the spirit of the law rather than just ticking boxes as part of compliance. How is that varying idea, that different view on compliance really guided your compliance strategies?
I like to think of myself as a pragmatist. You are never going to hit 100% of all these things you're promising all the time, you know, every day. It just isn't going to happen. And you're best off concentrating on what has the most risk. And sometimes, maybe you will have some vulnerabilities that last longer. They last longer than your 14, 30, 90, 180. They end up on your poem, sure, but as long as you have a good understanding of where your gaps are and you're constantly working towards filling those gaps, then to me, it's, maybe you aren't 100% compliant, but that being said, you're meeting the spirit of the expectation of a lot of this, which is to be constantly working to make sure that you meet as much of it as possible and putting behind the resources to fill those gaps as soon as is reasonable. And it's better than being non-transparent with it all and just pretending like you meet things. So as long as you do have that internal measurement, you're working against it. You will have gaps at times, but you have to have that internal drive to be constantly improving and reviewing what you have to be meeting all the standards. And if you don't, then you will be failing both your company and your customers.
Yeah, I think that's smart. I mean, you like you said, you can't do everything for everyone, but if you're doing the things in priority, the things that are most important, the things that create the best bang, whether it's from an ROI perspective or a security perspective, you're going to come out successful, I think.
And now, Tom, that's not at odds, though, with continuous monitoring, right?
Well, the thing about continuous
I've got to ask the question.
Yeah, the thing about continuous monitoring is you don't have the leeway. You have to perform the actions that are required to meet your continuous monitoring. So you do have to put things on POAM. You do have to absolve the risk as quickly as possible. Mm-hmm. You have to communicate thoroughly when you don't. And the reality is the burden of communicating thoroughly is often worse than just doing the work to get it resolved. So do the work, get it resolved. And honestly, if things last on the POAM too long in the PMO or the agency you're working with notices and starts to have trouble with it, you're going to lose your ATO. So what you don't want to do is risk that. You just put that work in. It's a little, FedRAMP, the FedRAMP world with continuous monitoring is a little bit different than like the SOC 2 world in that sense, right? The urgency of things is very apparent on a monthly basis.
Yeah, and it ultimately tying it back to top line revenue, as Alex did, it's a non-trivial amount of revenue at risk if you've got an agency contract where, 7 digits of zeros after the first number, it would be a small contract. So I think that the message comes that for some of these, like you can absolutely deprioritize and just have your critical controls. But for those that are covered by FedRAMP under that continuous monitoring, like Tom said, like fix them as fast as they come up as opposed to trying to communicate them because it sounds painful and is painful.
That's right.
I think the last question I want to ask you about, Alex, is just going back to the top. You said that you hadn't done the JAB route, the Joint Authorization Board route for FedRAMP. Why did you choose to not go for JAB, and how did that affect your overall strategy?
Well, one really fun thing was talking to the FedRAMP PMO. And we talked to them about where we're at, kind of some of the leads we had. We had some nice communications with customers or potential customers in the federal space. And they're like, yeah, we haven't heard of you. Just get out of here with your JAB. We don't want you here. Like, I don't know why you're talking to us. I mean, it wasn't quite that drastic, but they're like, you have to be a bigger player. You have to have a lot of federal demand for JAB to even make sense. We're not even going to consider you. It's a lottery to begin with. The agency route just seemed that much cheaper. And ultimately, again, this is all bottom line and revenue. If we can keep it cheaper, then we get better return on our investment. And for us, naturally, and kind of as I learn more about it, it seemed like maybe going the agency route, trying to get a few agencies, and then at some point looking at JAB to see if it made sense to maybe expand. But just getting on the marketplace seemed like it was the most important thing, and the agency route definitely seemed like the easier way of doing that. Another part of it was the agency route seemed easier because agencies have a little bit more leeway in kind of how they work with you on approvals. It doesn't necessarily have to go through the FedRAMP PMO. With the jab, it seems like there's a much higher burden of proof for what you're delivering. And again, as a smaller company, there are some places where we weren't quite hitting the mark where we were hoping, and we were hoping that going that the agency route would be better for us.
Yeah, you hit all the right points, right? It's more expensive. It's a lottery, which means I think they, on a good year, they get 20 companies through jab on a good year. So the likelihood of getting there is very low. And then the third point about them, the higher burden, I always tell folks going through the jab versus going through an agency, and think of an agency as a general practitioner and think of the jab as a proctologist, because that's the difference in the exam you're going to get.
It's high school versus, professional league, right? Like it's not quite that drastic, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, cool. So, then that kind of also mirrors our own journey, Tom, right? Like we kind of briefly glanced at jab and went, why would we ever?
That's right. Especially on the timeline we had, it was completely unrealistic to think that we could get into the jab whatsoever. And then again, when you look at the companies that have gone through jab, it's Google, it's Microsoft, it's the biggest players on the planet. It's not the Hyperproofs of the world. We're going to be there one day, Kayne, but we're just not that big of a player, and jab won't talk to us.
Well, also we had an accelerated timeline, and I don't think that it would have worked for our needs ultimately.
That's right.
Well, those are all the questions I wanted to ask you about, Alex, other than your thought on the beer. And we do beer reviews on the show. We use a 10-point scale. Typically, we don't have the guests review the beers first because they're the people who suggested the beer, so they might be biased. Although I think in the case of Victoria, she suggested 3 different beers, and we had to rate each one of these. Today, we've only got 1 to rate. So again, this is, this is a giant bottle. Lindemans Framboise. It says it's crafted by wind, brewed through generations. A whole story on the background here. Tom, do you want to review this one first, and then I'll have a go?
I'd be happy to. So, if you were just to review this on drinkability, it's pretty high. It's super easy to drink. There's none of the harsh alcohol flavor that you get in some beers at all. If you don't like tart, you won't like it. But you know me, Kayne. I like the craft of beer. I certainly like the alcohol of beer. So while this tastes good, I'm never going to stock it in my fridge. I'll probably save these for my daughter. She'll love it. Actually, she loves raspberry, and she anything that looks fancy she likes. So on drinkability, I'd give it like an 8. On whether or not I would keep it around, I'd probably give it like a 4.
Intriguing.
So we'll average them together. What is that? A 6?
6.
6?
Yeah. Roughly. Yeah. All right, so you're giving it a 6. So I've been standing here thinking about this the whole episode, and first of all, I'm going to just see if it's still aggressively raspberry.
I think it gets tartar, Kayne.
Well, the nose has not changed. I want to see if it gets tartar after having some oxidation in it. Yeah, that gets tartar. I don't know what I'd do with this. And what's funny is my boyfriend was telling me about some beer that's brewed and it comes in a bottle with a cork in, and I'm going to ask him after the episode if this is the same stuff, just to find out, like, if this is the one, because he said he liked it and it was the only beer he liked. I don't like beer. He doesn't like beer. But what I'm coming to is like, it's like like I said, it's like a Lambrusco, which is an Italian red wine, but this is the raspberry version, which doesn't exist in reality. And I've been thinking, like, could I make sangria out of this? Well, sangria isn't meant to be sour. Sangria is meant to be sweet, and so you'd have to add sugar and fruit to it. And if you're adding sugar to your sangria, you're doing it wrong already. And it doesn't taste like beer. Like that's the weirdest part about this is allegedly beer.
It's a fermented.
Is this like a malt beverage? Is this like the Oli basically of?
This is brewed just like other beer. They just add raspberry juice to it.
It's a real beer.
Oh, gosh, I will say it is better than that raspberry sour that my friend Cody put me up to on this show. That was just straight up terrible, even though they were Whatcom County raspberries. In terms of giving it a review, it's the best beer I've had on the show. I can't think of why I'd ever drink this. Like straight up, this is neither fish nor fowl. I'm going to give it a 5.
Nice.
But again, I would never have this on hand, and I don't know what you do with it. Maybe cooking? I don't know.
People do cook with this. It's pretty
freaky, strange stuff.
Pretty common.
You can probably make it.
I'm going with a 5 on this one.
You can probably make a
highest review ever on a show.
Yeah, what's the lowest review? 1, I assume, for most of them.
It was a 1, and it was this.
By both of us.
It was this Kauai-themed art can. I bought it mostly because of the can, and it was cinnamon sticky bun ale. And I was sick after the show. Tom was sick after the show. It was a bad time.
I think it's when we do a single beer, I think it's the only time I didn't drink the beer. I mean, I took like 2 sips and I was like, I put it back. So it's a little rough.
Yeah, it was pretty bad. But that was a 1.
I'd hardly say this is my favorite beer,
about this?
But I think this is the beer I give to people because I watched previous episodes and I saw this face over and over again. I'm like, I wonder if I can get him to drink something and not make that face. You still kind of made it. But that being said, there's a couple of people who say, I don't like beer, I give them this. And then all of a sudden they try some other things which are a little bit more beery than this. And they're like, oh, well, maybe that isn't so bad. It's one of those gateway type drugs. I personally don't stock this, but it's enjoyable now and then.
And on a 10-point scale, what would you give it?
Probably like a 7.
7.
Nice.
Okay, so we've got a 5, a 6, and a 7 on this episode for Lindemans Framboise, brewed since 1822. Neat. In Brussels, not France. So with that, that's all for today. If you think you know a beer that I'd like, because clearly this is a 5, so maybe more like this. Or if you have a FedRAMP question, drop it in the comments below, and remember to like our LinkedIn and YouTube pages to hear live interviews with information security professionals. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.